So that's a great question of whether entrepreneurship can be taught or not. I was a practitioner for 21 years doing 8 startups, and my friends who knew me as an entrepreneur laughed when they heard I was teaching, because I got the same response saying, Steve, you were a born entrepreneur. There's no possible way you could teach it to people who are not like you. And actually, that kept in the back of my head for at least 10 years as I was teaching entrepreneurship. And then I realized we were asking the wrong question. While it sounds good, that is, can entrepreneurship be taught? I think the question is much better understood if we reframe it and ask, who can entrepreneurship be taught to? And then you get to a really interesting answer. Entrepreneurship can only be taught to the people who desperately want to learn it. To those where entrepreneurship is a calling, not a job. Because entrepreneurs are not accountants. Founders startups are typically not founded by accountants. Founders are artists. And in fact, the right metaphor for teaching entrepreneurship is to realize that, at least for founders, we're teaching art. Yet we've figured out how to teach art 500 years ago during the Renaissance. We no longer ask, is it possible to teach how to compose music or sculpt or paint or whatever? And the metaphor is, we understand for artists, we teach theory, but we also teach a ton of experiential practice. And that is how we teach entrepreneurship nowadays. At least in the 21st century, we've realized that there are 2 components to entrepreneurship education: theory and a lot of hands-on practice. Now, 100 years ago, we also realized something about art, is that while we understood how to teach the people who've already been called or understand that that's what they want to do as a career, we realized 100 years ago that teaching art appreciation in the very early grades, just to see if people were interested in art, was something that was great. And I think we're starting to understand that as well. We need to teach entrepreneurial appreciation in middle schools, high schools, early stages, as kind of a, hey, if you're interested in, if that's that feeling inside of you, there is a career. So to answer your question, can entrepreneurship be taught? Sure, but you can't teach it like it's accounting. It's not a job, it's a calling. So that's a pretty broad question. I'm assuming you mean, how do I see entrepreneurial education being disrupted? Well, if you think about it, in the 20th century, the capstone or top-level class you would take in a university for entrepreneurship was they would teach you how to write a business plan. And that was it. You would feel good, and you wrote a plan, and therefore you thought, you knew all about entrepreneurship. You figured out market size, and in Appendix A, you did income statement, balance sheet, and cash flow, and you thought you were a genius. It turns out, though, that anybody teaching you that in the 20th century kind of knew they were lying to you, because no business plan survives first contact with customers. And in fact, most investors never read your business plan. And the problem was we didn't know what we should really be teaching. And so now if you go back to the first question of how do we educate entrepreneurs? Well, what we now understand is what we ought to be teaching them as a capstone class is theory and practice. And so what we've done is taken all the components of a lean startup, and we now teach basically all the components of business model design, Alexander Osterwalder's work, customer development, my work, agile engineering, which comes out of the software business, and put that together in a hands-on experiential class. So I think entrepreneurial education has been radically disrupted in the last 5 years or so. My class, the Lean Launchpad, has been adopted by 165 colleges and universities worldwide from 0 in 4 years. We train 200 educators a year, in fact, here in this room. And it's been adopted in the US by our National Science Foundation as the standard for commercializing science. So I think the answer is that we're now at another level of understanding what it takes to teach entrepreneurs in educational institutions. And in fact, my comment to anybody watching is that if your school is teaching you how to write a business plan, change schools. Sure. So again, I want to differentiate the idea between entrepreneurial survey classes or appreciation classes versus what I call capstone classes, or like you're going to Juilliard for music in New York, or you're going to a conservatory because you know this is your career. That is, entrepreneurial education needs to be broad to people who are just interested in figuring out what it is, and then serious commitment for people who want to do it. What I think we've brought for the first time is understanding how to teach the people who are serious. And the problem is that's very hard in an academic setting, because we're used to patting people on the head and saying, oh, you just showed up for class, thank you, that's an A. That's not what the real world looks like in entrepreneurship. And so entrepreneurial education, the hands-on methods we teach, actually feel exactly like it feels in a startup, and that's not a comfortable place. In a startup, you have a gun to your head the day you start, which says, I'm running out of money, and I'm moving with speed and urgency, and as the founding CEO, I'm not getting much sleep because I worry about a lot of stuff. If you take our class, that's exactly what you're going to feel like. And so I think that notion has been missing from, at least from business schools and engineering schools. We know how to do it in medical schools, we know how to do it in law schools, but now we're bringing that type of rigor to entrepreneurial education. I tend to characterize startups in 4 different buckets. Those that are entering existing markets. That is, how do you know it's an existing market? Well, you go out and find customers, and they could tell you the name of the market, and they could even tell you who the competitors are and what features they like and what they don't and what pricing is, and you could actually discover a lot of stuff. That's what Clayton and Christensen would have labeled a sustaining or an existing market. There's a subset of that market, by the way, which I call resegmenting an existing market. You might decide you want to enter that market, but the existing incumbents might be monopolists or duopolists, and the cost of entry is so high that a direct head-to-head competition, you don't have the funds. So you might decide to do a low-cost strategy or a niche strategy targeting specific new users, or a blue ocean strategy creating a market out of its components. But there's a third type of market, which is the one that Christensen calls disruptive. I call it new market, but it has the same characteristics. And disruptive innovation means there are no customers. In fact, these are the things that Peter Thiel and Steve Jobs and Thomas Edison said, if I would have asked people what they wanted, I would have got a horse with 6 legs, or I would have built a mainframe if I was Jobs. These are the people who see things, or classic example nowadays is Elon Musk. Tesla and SpaceX are not variants on existing markets. There are radical disruptions everywhere, from distribution channels to obviously the way the transportation works, electric versus internal combustion engine. These require visionaries, and what's really interesting is in those markets, you can't actually do customer discovery the same way you do in the first 2, because there's no one to ask what features you want. But it doesn't mean you still sit in the building. It means you do a different type of customer discovery. So if you have that taxonomy, then it's pretty simple, I think, to differentiate between, is everything disruptive? To me, disruptive is you're seeing things that don't exist. They're not variants on existing markets. By the way, there's a 4th type of market, is that, and that's what I call a clone market. A clone market is you take a business model that's worked in the US or somewhere else, and because of language barriers or regulatory barriers or cultural barriers, you, as I could politely say, adapt and adopt it for your region or country. Clone markets are, China for sure, where the Great Firewall stops most US products from appearing, for Russia as well, and other places where there are language or regulatory barriers. And so those are the 4 types of startups, and disruptive is a pretty special category. No customers exist, no market exists, and while you think you're a visionary, I'll just offer as an aside, the data says you're hallucinating, but we're glad you're going to do it anyway. So if you're asking the question then, you might as well be either updating your resume or checking your vesting schedule, because it turns out the thing we never understood as founders, and VCs kind of, venture capitalists instinctually understood it, but weren't able to articulate it, is what founders are great at is searching for the business model. That is, they might be great technologists but why you let founders run their company for the first year is they're the ones who are crazy enough to work 24/7, get a reality distortion field to get and recruit great people, to be able to get in sync with early customers. That's what founders are good for. But the minute you find a repeatable and scalable business model, you're no longer doing search. And this is a big idea that we don't articulate too well. The skill set the CEO now needs is no longer running around 24/7. It's about building organizations. It's about teaching other people how to do what they've actually found that works. And so now it's about execution. And this transition from search to execution, there's no manual for it. No one even says, no. It's not that you were stupid before and you're dumb now or you're dumb before and whatever. It's that what we need you to do to build the company requires a different set of skills. And I used to call this the secret memo that VCs, would never send you. When you'd say in a board meeting, we found a repeatable and scalable business model, you were standing there waiting for them to pin the medal on your chest and give you a parade. And then you were thinking about being the CEO of a 1,000-person company. And meanwhile, the investors are looking at each other, giving each other the secret time to hire a search firm to find a CEO, because they know that your skill set is no longer applicable here. Smart investors nowadays, very smart investors, and very smart founders get that transition happens. In the past, you'd always hear stories of the venture capitalist stole my company and brought in a suit, an executive. And I think hopefully in the 21st century, we can articulate a bit more what's needed to actually turn that great idea into a viable business with some liquidity event, that is the ability to make money for investors and the founders. Of course, there's a standard list that I think now people could kind of agree on. You have to be agile. You have to be tenacious, that is being able to lock on to something. You have to be relentless, chase things forever. You have to be resilient, and resilient means you're going to get smacked down to the ground a lot, and you can't spend time worrying about how that feels. You need to get up and do it again. And sometimes between companies and hopefully inside of a company, you just bam, 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 that was wrong, that didn't work. And here's a couple that people don't talk about. I think founders need to be curious, at least founding CEOs. If you're not curious about a lot of things, you're going to miss a lot of things. For me, I've found analogies in particle physics to computational fluid dynamics to mathematical topology to solving circuit design problems, etc. And unless you kind of have a broad range of skills, you're going to just miss some pattern recognition things. And then probably the last piece, which no one talks about, is I found a very interesting correlation, at least here in Silicon Valley, between founding CEOs who come from dysfunctional families and then percent who actually run them. It turns out that this might be the first job in their lives that founders from dysfunctional families actually have a large advantage over people from normal homes. Turns out if you're a survivor of a dysfunctional family, or you're somebody who's made a very long journey in your life from growing up in a village somewhere to coming to Silicon Valley, you figured out how to shut out all the noise and just focus on what's important in your life while there's chaos around you. It's probably the world's cruelest training ground to be a founding CEO, but it actually turns out to be the most effective. The bad news, by the way, about those people is when, in fact, the company becomes stable and is no longer chaotic and is in execution mode, these types of founders throw emotional hand grenades into their own company to keep the chaos going. I think, number one is because I teach entrepreneurship, I see a lot of students doing entrepreneurship because it's cool. And because it's trendy, and because it's cheap to do now, where before it required a lot of money to start a company. All those are the world's worst reasons to want to become an entrepreneur. Most entrepreneurs are going to fail, and they're going to fail their entire career. Entrepreneurship is a large part luck, a large part pattern recognition, a large part timing, a large part your ability to create reality distortion fields and partnerships. It's a calling, and I used the analogy earlier to an artist. You don't decide you want to paint or sculpt or play music if you're in it for the money. or become a photographer or a reporter or a writer. Those are not jobs. Those are things you do for the sheer joy of you can't imagine to do anything else. And so what I remind entrepreneurs is, if that doesn't fit your description and you think you've signed up for a job, you're in the wrong place. Here in the Valley, it's still hard to convince outsiders that this Valley was built for people who would have done this for free. The ability to work on some of the most advanced technology and create things that never happened before and deliver them to thousands, potentially millions, and now billions of people, where else in the world can you do that? And at the end, if you're lucky enough, get more money than you ever imagined. But it's not the money. And I'll just emphasize, it's not only not the money, there's a Zen-like thing, is the more you chase the money, the further away it will be. I never did it for the money. The money came much later, but I would have said I had a great career if I was still living in the same place I did when I came out to Silicon Valley. It's very funny. I think the more people with different backgrounds who get into building startups, we're all better for it, whether it's women or people from different cultures or people with different aesthetics or whatever. I think if you really think about venture capital, they're not looking for cool or immediate. I mean, though they vary, they're looking for huge and big and irrational returns. And so, the Instagrams and the WhatsApps, basically now there's a platform that allows billions of people to become users of your product. And so any type of application or platform, or Uber, Airbnb, the whole sharing economy, that kind of creates that potential, then investors will be piling money into it because, with all due respect, they have no particular interest about society. They're coin operated that is, venture capital is nothing more than a financial asset class. While they like to think they're shapers of the universe, etc., they're not running nonprofits. And they have limited partners who are looking for, excuse the expression, obscene returns. And so they will put their money where they best think they will get those returns. I'm not using that as a value judgment, but that's just the fact. So there are some that will bet on, there's platforms like Facebook and mobile and whatever, and I will bet on those because I could see immediate returns if these startups work. And there are others, again, the Peter Thiels of the world, who kind of invest in what Clayton Christensen calls disruptive markets, and I call new markets, where they don't even exist at all. There might be billions, but it's going to take a lot longer, and I can't even see whether there are customers or even a platform. Those are the SpaceX's and Teslas and others, where you have to be crazy you mean you're going to put people on Mars? What does that have to do with, launching rockets? Well, I'm going to make a ton of money on the way to going to Mars. So those are two paths to kind of the same objective. These are not NGOs trying to make society better. If they happen to do it as a side effect, then I think they're not unhappy with that as a goal. But remember, they're just an outgrowth of capitalism. By the way, which is one of the good things about capitalism, and also good things about innovation in Silicon Valley, if I can. These disruptive activities operate in an environment here where there's no bounding box or limit on what industries we could destroy or create or whatever. There's some regulatory things and whatever. But if you think about it, in the US, you could, and obviously Finland and the EU almost so, be able to challenge the status quo without going to jail or dying. That's not true in most other places in the world. If you go against a state-owned enterprise in China or one of Putin's buddies' corporations, you're not going to be having your company too long. Or worse, if you try to cross the Great Firewall in China or talk about topics that are forbidden by the propaganda department, you're not going to be in the startup business anymore. And therefore, there's a bounding box on how much freedom you have to be creative. And I believe the kind of metric for creativity for entrepreneurs is how that each society treats its dissidents. If you jail or kill your dissidents, then you're going to do the same to your most creative entrepreneurs, and you're going to strangle that type of innovation. So, you know, the investment readiness level it's just a tool. It's not a replacement for anybody's good judgment, and it's not a replacement for, gee, we're going to just plug numbers in and see whether we invest or not. But I just kind of was reacting to watching my students and entrepreneurs pitch at VC firms, and you know, you can almost tell whether the partners have had coffee or not, or whether they're looking at their watch for another meeting, and in fact, the same presentation pitched at different times of the day would get very different reactions. And between partners, you have partners reacting in different ways. I didn't like their font, or gee, you know, his shirt was unbuttoned, or you go, well, what about the idea? And I realized that there was no coherent numbers or even a common language that we could share about, at the core, what did we think about, like, was this a viable deal? And so about 40 years ago, NASA and then ESA, European Space Agency, adopted something called the technology readiness levels, which basically said before we put a spacecraft into orbit, we need to make sure they go through a certain level of kind of, is it ready, from level 0 to it's just theory to level 9 to we're ready to fly it. And I realized we could probably now with the lean startup gather enough evidence, that is, create something called evidence-based entrepreneurship, to allow investors to say, okay, well, let's rank the technology, is this ready to go? But also let's rank its business model. Have they found product market fit? You know, do they have like revenue? Do they have a plan for monetization? And in each firm and for each technology, we could decide among ourselves as partners, do we care or not about these things, and kind of rank what is it we care about. And so when we have a partner discussion, we can actually go through a checklist and say, well, I thought they were 5 out of 10, or no, these guys or women had really nailed it at 9 out of 10. And so the investment readiness level simply gives investors and entrepreneurs a common language of how well are they doing on the path to commercialization.